Hello, shalom, and welcome to another episode of Community Relations Corner, where we discuss issues of concern to New York's Jewish community and our friends and neighbors all over the city and the metropolitan area. I'm your host, Michael Miller, the Executive Vice President and CEO of the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, JCRC-NY, and on each episode of Community Relations Corner, we're joined by guests representing the political, religious, economic, and diverse community leadership in New York, many of whom I've had the honor and pleasure of getting to know over the course of my tenure at JCRC-NY. Together, we'll discuss current events impacting New York's Jewish community and our friends and neighbors, as well as the state of the city, the state of the state, the state of the nation, and sometimes even the state of the world. Today, we are truly excited to have a wonderful friend join us, and that is Dr. Mehnaz Afridi. Dr. Afridi is the director of Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan College. She's on the Committee of Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. She was on the advisory board of what we had as a coalition, our Women in Faith program, and is currently involved in JCRC's Interfaith United Coalition. Welcome. Greetings, Mehnaz. Wonderful to see you.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's always nice to work with Jewish Community Relations Council of New York. And I also want to give a shout out to my very good friend, Bob Kaplan, who sits on my board at the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center. And he and I have done a lot of community work together. So this is a true honor. Thank you so much.
Hey, you're welcome. And I'd be derelict if I didn't wish you a Ramadan Mubarak.
Thank you.
And it's really very, very important to us that you're joining us on the first day of Ramadan. Before we went live, Mehnaz informed me that she was up at 4 o'clock or something this morning, and before prayers was able to eat, I assume?
Yes.
And fasting during the day and breaking the fast after sunset, somewhere in the vicinity of 7:25 approximately.
Correct, yeah.
And I was sharing with her that we in the observant Jewish community also know about the times of day when the sun rises, when the sun sets, and all, just as there are 5 times during the day that Muslims pray, there are 3 times during the day that the members of the Jewish faith pray. So, and we have much in common, a lot of which we're going to be talking about during the course of our time together. But let's start, as I generally do, by learning more about you. I've gotten to know you a little bit. Bob knows you a lot better, but let's talk about your childhood and where you are today. And you have recently written a book, which we'll get to in a few moments, but having read parts of it, I understand that you were born in Pakistan to parents of Indian extraction.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Ramadan Kareem and Mubarak to everybody. It's an honor to be here working with a Jewish organization as a Muslim, especially in Ramadan. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because yesterday I was on the Voice of America for Pakistan.
Really?
And I pointed out to her that Jews pray 3 times a day. We pray 5 times a day. I was trying to get her to understand why I did so much interfaith work, but also the work I do on the Holocaust. So I was born in Pakistan and raised in Western Europe. I went to Zurich, London, Geneva, and the Middle East, and ended up in New York in 1984 in high school, up the street in Scarsdale High School. Went to Syracuse and got my PhD at University of South Africa. So this journey was really indelible to me, because I was always brought up Muslim, practicing Muslim, in a wonderful household with my parents and my brother. And I had friends who were primarily Jewish or Hindus, many Christians, but it seemed like the Jews, the Muslims, and the Hindus kind of hung out together. And I think that was because we were kind of the outsider, the other, in terms of the majority of these kids at these schools. A lot of these schools, and I was very privileged growing up, were private schools with lots of Americans, but also Europeans. So I had this idea that, you know, all faiths grew up together. I would go home to Pakistan every summer, where I have a lot of ties. My family's still there. And in the Middle East, when I got there, there were no Jews. And so that's where my questions began as a child. And I started to think about what happened to the Jews and what happened to the textbook, because they were taking away the name Jew in Israel. And my friends seemed to think it was a normal occurrence. To me, it was strange, weird. I didn't know, really. I didn't have the language to really say what's going on. And then when I went to Scarsdale, my parents were harassed by phone calls from a lot of Jewish neighbors saying, "You effing Arabs, get out of here." So as a young person, this was the first spark where I got interested. What's going on? I mean, I went to my friend's home for Hanukkah. They came over for iftar. This is when we were children. So what happened here? That's how it began, the journey.
Yeah. So how did that really impact you, upon you, particularly with your parents being harassed? Maybe you might have picked up the phone yourself at times and hearing those epithets. And most especially, I also want to get into your feelings as a woman in the Muslim world, growing up here in America, all these different dynamics of the freedoms that you have here in this country. I mean, again, we deal with it in the Jewish world as well. How have you dealt with it?
I mean, I mean, there's a few things. So I was, the younger sibling growing up in a Muslim household. My household was patriarchal. It was not at all oppressive. But, we had the patriarchal kind of lens that, my brother would go to college and I would kind of get married off at some point. So that's sort of but then of course I fought all that and went to school and got educated and got my PhD, etc. But being a woman, I think in any tradition, and I know a lot about Judaism and feminism and a lot of Jewish women, is that it's a struggle because you're trying to represent your faith, but you're also trying to represent an identity that's different from the traditional norm. So you're breaking this stereotype while you're also trying to engage people in terms of the ethics of your faith, the social justice in your faith, also the values that are given out there. And when I was in Scarsdale as a young girl, I was very scared of what was happening. It was very fearful for me. And the language to me growing up in Europe, using swear language and the way the kids behave with teachers also was very scary, because I was raised to respect your teacher, not to swear. There was a huge cultural divide when I came to the United States. That was actually the cultural shock that I felt.
Yeah, I'm sure that cultural shock is still impacting on you today, and how you've developed yourself over the years and your character. One of the twists and turns in life that you have taken is the study of the Holocaust. You're the author of a very penetrating book entitled Shoah Through Muslim Eyes. How did you find your place in the world of Holocaust education as a Muslim woman? I saw that one of the first sentences that you have in the book is that the denial of the Shoah is a crime against humanity. How did you arrive at that conclusion?
So, I mean, we just passed Yom HaShoah on April 8th, and we did a program at my center. The Holocaust is a catastrophe. It's one of the most unprecedented genocides in the world. I argued that in my book. And why the Holocaust? Because I fell into becoming a teaching assistant at Syracuse University with Dr. Alan Berger, who is a post-Holocaust literature scholar. And I just fell into it. I took, of course, a great deal of interest and became sort of a lecturer for him. He would go away and I would just take on the class, and I got very, very much deeply involved with Holocaust stories and narratives. And not only that, but Judaism and what Judaism was about. It almost felt like all we knew about Jews were Israel, Holocaust, nothing about the tradition, nothing about the history. And then I worked with Michael Berenbaum when I was in Los Angeles. I went to the Museum of Tolerance. My master's was focused on 20th century Germany and philosophy. So to me, it was almost a natural thing to understand some people's suffering was so important to me. One of the biggest catastrophes in the world, to me, still is the Holocaust, and why it happened in terms of prejudice of religion, and then which changed into prejudice of racialization. And I felt that if I could educate Muslims about the Holocaust and the Jewish tradition, perhaps we could understand something beyond the politics of every day, beyond this binary situation that we have created, Jews and Muslims with one another. And that has been my hope forever, Michael, is to fight anti-Semitism as a Muslim. I feel very strongly that we must stand up for each other in terms of racism and prejudice, especially anti-Semitism today, especially in this country, which is sad for me to say.
And I want to share with our viewers one of the lines that you wrote in the book, that you've dedicated your life to those who suffer under the oppression of racism and intolerance. And it appears that through you've entered into that world of fighting racism and intolerance through the lens of the Shoah. And in fact, you rather use the term Shoah rather than Holocaust. So why is that?
Right. I mean, so I explain why I use that. I mean, number one, I want the audience to understand, and you to understand, that I am in genocide studies. So Holocaust is used for other genocides. Some people refer to the African American Holocaust, Bosnian Holocaust, and I get a lot of questions, why Shoah? Holocaust, also the Greek root and the meaning is burnt offering. And to me, that had a religious connotation that did not sit well with me personally. And I wanted Shoah, the Hebrew word, the catastrophe, to become the prominent word in my book, that it gave, in terms of my book, it gave Jews the unprecedented sort of value here, rather than just using word Holocaust or genocide.
Well, can you tell us more about just the process of writing the book, and what your feelings were actually when you finished writing the book and the book was then made public? What did you hope to accomplish through this book that wasn't previously in world literature?
Well, I mean, the first thing, the reason I wrote the book is of complete frustration within my own Muslim community. I was fed up, tired, angry, sometimes sad, because there was so much denial and Holocaust relativization. I would say more so relativization in at least the Muslim communities I was living in. I had to break off relationships with people because of the anti-Semitism or the denial of certain things that happened during the Holocaust. So I simply, Michael, in a very simple, genuine way, wanted to put out a simple book. It's not written in a very academic way. It's very academically researched. I wanted it to be part for the public, to say, look, I am a Muslim woman. I'm putting down 6 billion Jews plus died in the Holocaust. This is exactly what happened. These were the camps. And I am saying it on paper. It was never really put on paper before. And I know that may mean nothing to people, but to me, it was the first step in acknowledging the suffering and putting it down on paper with real academic research. And the second thing was that I wanted to interview survivors. That was very important to me, which I call in the book, the document.
Yes, and some of the interviews are really very penetrating and very, very moving. And I very much appreciate having read as much as I've read that you've written. And there's one other line before we continue that I wanted to ask you about. You write how your closeness to Islam intensified and was inspired by studying Judaism.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if people have, yeah, I'll explain it to you. I mean, I think what's interesting is that, as a religious studies scholar who teaches, mainly Islam, but also Judaism and Christianity. Right now I'm teaching Buddhism.
At a Catholic college.
At a Catholic college, correct. So, I mean, and I'm not a Catholic scholar. I'm more of a Protestant theologian, actually. You really look at me. But one of the things that I think is an amazing discovery as somebody who's faithful is when you study someone else's religion or you read someone else's sacred text or you go to a service or you make it a regular habit, you actually start to look at your faith in a different way. And it brought me closer and more intimately to Islam in a way that I thought I could never even imagine. So this is something maybe just personal with me, but I encourage listeners, audiences, students, everybody. It's so important that we read each other's text. It's imperative, because I tell my Muslim students that you cannot read the Quran and understand Judaism and Christianity. You have to read the Torah, you have to read the Bible, because that is the interpretive sense that we put on these traditions. It's very, very valuable. I know we don't have time for all of us just read each other's texts, but I think even if we read a few quotes from each other's texts, it would make a big difference in our life.
At Yeshiva University, where I got my BA and my master's degree, we took a course entitled Intellectual Jewish History. And within that course, we read from the Quran, we read from the Christian Bible. To have an intellectual understanding of our own faith, it was very much appreciated, knowing how other faiths and their texts influence those other faith groups. So
beautiful.
we need truly to intellectualize religion. And anyway, I just want to recommend to all of our viewers, as we're going to move on from this subject, that they read Shoah Through Muslim Eyes by Dr. Mehnaz Afridi. Okay. So we talked about Judaism and Islam. So let's talk about the intersection of the negative dimension of that, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Why is there a tension between Muslims and the Holocaust? How can we do better as Jews and Muslims with regard to trust?
Wow. Okay. So, I'll tell you a story, and I think this will make this was a challenge. So when I was hired at Manhattan College, which is the Lasallian Catholic College, and I love my college, I just want to say a word about them. They have supported me immensely. I am a Lasallian, and to be a Lasallian is not difficult because you don't give up your faith.
Right.
You believe in the presence of God, and you have human dignity for others. It's really a wonderful little place in Riverdale, New York. And when I was hired, there was a lot of controversy over my hire because I'm the first Muslim to head a Holocaust center in the world, which is kind of weird when I say it, but it's actually true. And the pushback was from a lot of Jews in New York City saying, how can a woman carry the memory of the Holocaust? The first thing she's going to do is talk about the Palestinian genocide. The first thing, and there were horrible comments, Michael, like, you might as well hire a neo-Nazi. And that hurt me so much. Yes. So there was a lot of, if you Google it, it was crazy. It's been a while. It's been almost 10 years. But a lot of the people who spoke out, from Brooklyn to New York City, to Long Island, to Staten Island, to Queens, recently in the last 3 years have said, if everyone could be like Dr. Afridi, we would have better relations. Now, I'll tell you that's important. I'm not saying this is a great thing that I did. It's a great way to understand the fear and mistrust we have. And it's a great example to show that it takes a while for us to trust one another. And it takes certain gestures and examples of what we do as Muslims and Jews for each other, for people to say, hey, you know what? Michael Miller really cares about Muslims. And I think, we have to be patient. And we have to be patient with our leaders, but also give them a chance. And I think this is one of the reasons that we have so much fear and mistrust. And of course, as you know, a lot of the anti-Semitism in my community comes from very much a European colonial anti-Semitism that seeped through in many parts of the Arab world. I talk a lot about in my work and have a course called Muslims in the Holocaust, where I talk about North Africa,
Yes.
the issue government there. There's so many stories we don't know and we don't understand. There's so many Muslims that don't even know why they're anti-Semitic. There has been so much data recently carved out, and I think a lot of this work is coming into the open, where you ask young Muslim males, why do you hate Jews? They really don't know. They say, oh, isn't it something that happened in early Islam? Isn't it because of Israel? They're just completely nebulous. So I think it's the stories that they have been told that are unconsciously there over and over again. This is what I want to break in the Muslim community. What narrative are we telling our children about Jews and
Yes.
Judaism and Israel, right?
Right.
I mean, I'm not scared to talk about that either. I want my Jewish brothers and sisters to ask the same question. What stories do we tell about Muslims, Arabs, and Palestinians? I think it's so important that we do that in order for us to have courageous conversations about what's going on.
And you spent time in Jerusalem, I believe it was 1995. You were in Israel. So how were you able to step into that country, considering what your worldview was back then, and has it evolved?
Well, it was interesting you asked me that. I went on a Pakistani passport to Israel. My country does not, unfortunately, recognize Israel. And when I went to the Israeli embassy in New York, Dr. Berger and some of his colleagues recommended me. The Israeli embassy was very clear and said, listen, Mehnaz, you can go, you're young, but we can't protect you and Pakistan can't protect you. So God forbid something happens. So actually, Michael, I was young. I was like, yay, this is great. I'm in exile. I feel like I'm living the Exodus, right? Wandering around. So, but what was nice is I was able to go into both the Palestinian territories and Israeli parts. I studied with Israelis and Christians, Jews and Christians at Hebrew University in a class called Biblical Archaeology. Didn't like the class, but loved the people. And I came home and I said, oh my God, both of them talked about two things, peace and security, peace and security. And I came back and I just put it in my mind. And all of these experiences, as you know, Michael, we don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
And all of these things shaped my life in a way that was tremendous. And I was in Israel actually 2 years ago as well.
Really?
Yeah, for a global summit on anti-Semitism.
Yeah. I actually attended one of them a number of years ago myself. So speaking about anti-Semitism, we have a debate within the Jewish community on defining anti-Semitism between the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, known as IHRA, IHRA, but not IRA, IHRA, as well as a Jerusalem definition of anti-Semitism. So that's something which is being debated internal to the Jewish community, but I'm sure you have some views on that. But is something similar happening with regard to Islamophobia, of arriving at some definition of what that means? And is there a tension, as there is in the Jewish community, regarding its definition? So two questions.
Yeah, interesting. I know Mark Weitzman quite well, who is part of the IHRA, and also James Williams. I also know a lot of people who signed the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism. I understand the different sides, the kind of subtleties and challenges. Within the Islamophobia, here's the thing. In my book, I talk about that, and I call it anti-Muslim hate.
Yeah.
And the reason I do that is Islamophobia, it's an easier way to say it, just linguistically, but Islamophobia really is the fear of Muslims, right? There's some kind of psychological aversion to Muslims. And that doesn't sit well with a lot of Muslims. Anti-Muslim hate, it makes more sense. And I think also we have issues with when it's just anti-Arab, because Arabs are only 20% of the Muslim population.
Right.
Asians, which is what I am, are the highest in population, like Indonesia, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh.
Similarly here in New York,
the
majority of the Muslims in New York City are South Asian rather than Arab,
right.
Middle Eastern.
So, I mean, I think there are tensions, but I think Muslims are less than 1% in the United States. I think Jews are 1%. It's interesting how I ask my students, Michael, and I want your audience to know, when I teach Judaism, I say, how many Jews do you think there are in US? And their response is 40 million. I say, okay, how about the world? 1 billion.
Right.
Then I asked them, how many Muslims do you think there are in America? And they say 50 billion. 50 billion million. I mean, I'm just the numbers are so exaggerated in terms of Muslims and Jews. And these are non-Jewish and non-Muslim kids. And I think that gives me a real view of how they perceive this notion of the other as being Jewish and Muslim.
Yeah, but again, back to the issue of the debate. So, is there are there definitions that are being crafted as we speak regarding, let's say, it's anti-Muslim hate? By the way, there are those who will never use the term anti-Semitism. Semitism, well, many of the Muslims would consider themselves to be Semites. So again, we're not going to deal with the history of the term, but at least I had one of our leaders who insisted on our referring to it as anti-Jewish hate as opposed to anti-Semitic hate. But again, is there a global body which is deliberating currently on defining what is now referred to as Islamophobia?
I mean, there's the Islamic Society of North America. They're defining it. There is also the Runnymede Foundation, which defined in 1987. Then that's in Canada, and also there's a group in the UK that is defining it. So there are different definitions, but there's not such a debate in terms of anti-Semitism the way that we see it with the Jewish community. And I think it's because it's around one country, Israel, in terms of anti-Semitism. Whereas in the context of Muslims, we're about 50 countries. So it's really about the religious kind of fear that people have, especially in Europe, of Muslims. And that's where they still are using the term Islamophobia in places like Austria, in France, in Germany. And I work on those issues and see the differences of Islamophobia. And you can do studies where you can see differences between Islamophobia in America versus, say, a place like France. Same with anti-Semitism. But I think the debate that Jews are having is more about the state of Israel and how to critique the state of Israel.
Right.
Whereas I think more our debate would be, how do you critique Islamic extremism and who is the extremist in Islamic circles? Because once you say radical, then you say, okay, well, what does that mean? Or what does an extremist mean? And some people would just rather say ISIS, or Daesh, or say, Al-Qaeda or Taliban. So we have those issues on the Muslim side, which are very different because they're not really connected to a country, but to a group of people. And what do we name those group of people? Right. Definitely not conservative, because there are a lot of Muslim conservatives or fundamentalists. So that's been the debate within the Islamic scholarly and leadership group for a while now.
Yeah, so you spoke before about, as I did, regarding the parallels between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, but there are also clashes between them, and particularly revolving around Israel. And one of those clashes is around the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the BDS movement. What's your perspective on the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and how does BDS intersect with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict within your worldview?
Right. I mean, that's a very heavy question, but it's not something I haven't spoken about publicly or even privately. So my problem, Michael, is of the word sanction, divestment, boycott. And that if we just leave Israel off for a second, then I'll get to my argument. I was around when we sanctioned Iraq, Saddam Hussein, in terms of it was under Bush, I believe. And I remember I was in Los Angeles and my family and we were marching, demonstrating against the war in Iraq. Not that we like Saddam Hussein, not that we care about the thing, but we just did not want to go to war or sanction the country. The reason we didn't want to sanction the country, and everyone can look this up, is that we sanctioned the country and medical help did not get to 1.2 million children in that country. That to me was cruel and unnecessary. Recently, in terms of the Rohingya genocide,
yes,
I signed a petition with people I work with, the Rohingya Task Force, to the United Nations, sanctioning Myanmar's military.
mm-hmm.
I was very open and comfortable doing that. I would not sanction Myanmar as a country. I feel the same way about Israel. That to say we boycott, sanction, and divest in Israel is amorphous to me. It leaves people thinking about Israel as being a pariah state. It doesn't give any humanity to Israelis or Jews. I have not signed it and I will not sign it.
Mm.
I also feel that when the BDS movement started, I don't know how much of it is now because I'm not involved with it, had a statement which really horrified me about the extinction
Yes,
of the state of Israel.
it's a delegitimization of the state of Israel.
That is my stand on BDS. I also think the platform of BDS of Israel being an apartheid state is incorrect and historically not factual. I mean, I have studied genocide. I have studied apartheid. I mean, I talk about race relations. You can imagine the work I do. I run a center. And apartheid is not Israel. I've been to Israel as a Muslim woman. I know that 1.3 million Arab Israelis live there. I work with institutes like the Arava Institute that work with Israelis and Palestinians and Jordanians and Americans. There are no separate places. I do, however, very clearly state I have a lot of issues and criticisms of Israeli policies towards Palestinians and settlements. That is not, I mean, I have no qualms saying that because I think that that is a valid criticism, a political criticism. Just like I would say I have a real hardline criticism of Pakistan, the country I was born in terms of corruption and their silence on the Uyghurs right now. And I've been trying to send messages to Pakistan about that. I don't hate Pakistan, but I don't agree with Pakistan. I don't hate Israel, and I don't always agree with Israel.
So would you consider yourself to be both pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian at the same time? And
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But you know what? I get in trouble for that, Michael. You know, you've got to be one or the other. No.
Well, that's binary thinking. So how do you rise above, and maybe others should rise above that binary way of approaching the conflict, one or the other? I mean, this organization supports, as many do, even some right of center organizations. We're centrist, but right of center organizations will even support the two-state solution. The BDS movement supports a one-state solution with the dissolution, with the delegitimization of the state of Israel. So you're in a very, very awkward position, a very sensitive position, but you're also very outspoken. And you spoke just a year ago, January 5th, at our March Against Anti-Semitism, 25,000 plus people across the Brooklyn Bridge, which you can see behind me.
Beautiful event, yes.
Yeah, beautiful event, and you spoke beautifully. You spoke very movingly to us. So again, you're in the two worlds of the world of Islam and your proximity to Judaism, your study and knowledge of the Holocaust. Again, relating it back to the Israel issue is challenging, and you're being supportive of both, maybe even more challenging.
Michael, this is the way I will try and answer this, is that we are, I am a Muslim, and, God forgive me, it's Ramadan if I say anything that ever hurts anybody, but we are all equal. We're all human. And I am also not a Palestinian. And I want to say that very carefully, because there are 1.5 billion Muslims. Not everyone is Palestinian in that population. I also have no right to say what Palestinians want. Half of the time, I don't think Muslim leaders listen to what Palestinians want. The information we get, I watch Al Jazeera, and I watch Jewish news, and I watch BBC. It's completely the opposite.
Yes.
And that's why I watch all these. I watch Fox, and I tell my students to change their news screen when I teach, because I said, you'll get a slice of Egyptian news or Jordanian news or Pakistani news. It's so important to hear. It's all about narrative, Michael.
Yeah.
But when you sit down in silence with yourself as a critical thinker, a self-critical thinker, you ask yourself, what do I believe in? I believe in Palestinian rights, and I believe in Israeli rights. And I am not a politician, thank God, to sit down and carve out what piece belongs to my Jewish brothers and sisters and what piece belongs to my Muslim brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
There is a professor, Dr. Khalil Muhammad at UC San Diego, that wrote, and it is in the Quran, and I recently rewrote this in another article, is that in the Quran, God, our mutual God, gives a land to the children of Israel. Now, it's not said which land, but that is the only time that Allah gives land to someone. I'm not saying that has that necessary, but there is some significance about God talking to the children of Israel, making a covenant, not just in the Torah, not with just Abraham in the Torah, but in the Quran. Now, I would like Muslims to think about that for a second, because that does say that this lineage of Jews, Christians, Muslims is very connected, not just politically, but spiritually. And we come from the same area.
Well, based on this answer, I learned a word in your book that I'd love for you to explain to our viewers. And that's, if I mispronounce it, please forgive me. And that's the word tazkiyah.
Yeah.
Tazkiyah. So am I mispronouncing it?
No, tazkiyah, that's fine. Yeah. So this is one of the things that I love about Islam, is that there's a self-reflective mode. I think that one of the things that you asked me earlier about being a Muslim woman, so many Muslim women do not have access to their own sacred text. So therefore they don't know what their sacred text says, because they're illiterate. They're not allowed around the sacred text. And I feel that if they were educated, were given access to it, it would make a big difference. Tazkiyah would be how they would see it. The self-reflection, this thinking. Ibn Arabi, there's so many Maimonides, right? If we go back into our philosophy together as Jews and Muslims were in Iraq, Baghdad, translating texts from Greek into Hebrew and Arabic, while the Christians were destroying those texts. Something to be celebrated at that moment, and to reflect on that deeply and say, oh, well, that happened then. Yes, it happened, but what happened to that moment? Can we recreate these moments in the future for us in the modern times, even between this tension of Israel and Palestine?
Well, and the work that, thank you so much for that response. And the work that you do is really engaging in what I call social engineering, building bridges, and particularly the bridge, the interfaith work, the bridge between Islam and other faiths, particularly our faith, the Jewish faith. Navigating that on campus is one thing, but on the streets of New York is another. I believe that you have brought Muslim students into a synagogue and Jewish students into a mosque. So the basic question is, why do you do that? And once it is done, what do the students get out of it?
Yeah, Michael, I am an educator, and I believe in the classroom, but I believe in the experience of community. I believe that, when I look back at my life and I think of like, why am I on this journey? A lot of it has to do with my emotional ties with friends that were not Muslim, Jews, Christians, Hindus, etc., atheists, secular. I'm not really biased in terms of one's belief, but I am biased about one's human, respect for each other. And what I want to do and what I've done in the past is brought Jews and Christians inside of a mosque to refurbish a synagogue that was done in Park District, Bronx with Sheikh Drama. We've done work like the 9/11 walk to a mosque, to a church, to a temple. And the other really small lesson I have learned through my own students, sometimes you don't even need to talk about faith or prejudice. Sometimes they need to just hang out and look at each other's cell phones and their apps and have a conversation about music. And honestly, those are the most brilliant conversations because they've never really talked to a Jew or a Muslim before. But what they have in common is an app or a song that has nothing to do with Judaism or Islam. And these connections, these small connections, make a big difference in terms of teaching. It's not just the text, the content. It's not just the, learning the lesson or having a discussion. It's that human interaction. We have siloed ourselves so much that we really, really need to start to interact more. And I think that is happening a lot more here in America than anywhere else, which I think is a beautiful thing we need to celebrate more.
Are members of the Islamic faith engaging as much as members of the Jewish faith? We have a tradition here, the Tikkun Olam tradition. Is leadership, I mean, how many Mehnaz Afridis are there in the United States of America? And it's one of the things you had in the book, one of the questions I think that you posed is, has Islam lived up to its principles and ideals? Islam as a peace-loving faith group, and outreach is so much of a natural phenomenon here in the United States. Has the Islamic communities, again, we can't speak of one single community, have they engaged as much as you would like them to engage? And what else needs to be done in order to spur on some additional outreach from the Islamic community, the Jewish community, and in reverse?
I think that Muslims have done a lot, and there are a lot of, I won't say Mehnaz Afridis, but there are a lot of wonderful Muslim interfaith leaders. Sheikh Drama is one, JCRC-NY is one. I have a good friend, Maha Al-Jiddani. She's in San Francisco. She does a lot of work with Jews and Muslims. I think there's a lot of work being done. And I think what perhaps would be interesting is if we put all these people in a room or made, kind of a central, like a website, and actually focused on that rather than the differences to show there is Muslim advocacy. The Islamic Society in North America and American Jewish Committee has formed a partnership nationwide, and I'm in their New York office, and they've done amazing advocacy work in terms of religious, discrimination. Your organization has done the United Interfaith New York, where people have worked on food insecurity, which I've brought to my students now, right? So there are these networks and these things to do. And I think finally, if you think about this kind of advocacy, Michael, you have to choose where you want to live in your mind. You have to choose where you want to live in your mind. And I have made a really great choice where I'm surrounded just with marvelous people I don't think, I would have ever met if I had chosen a different direction in my life. But I feel like I'm surrounded by angels, in a sense, that are doing such amazing work in New York City, across the nation, internationally. And I think I say to my students, you may not realize this, but you make a choice where you want to live. And I don't mean that physically. I don't mean that economically. I don't mean that racially, but I mean that in your mind. And we have to start thinking that we have some control about how we think and how to make things, challenging, but also sincere in a way that we are surrounded by positive optimism. And we can see how to change the negative and pessimistic ways of people.
Well, I know that here in New York, between yourself and our Bob Kaplan, there's a lot of tremendous amount of positive energy that's invested. You referenced the mosque in the synagogue in Parkchester. If I remember correctly, it was a Young Israel synagogue.
Yes. Yeah.
And it lost its space, and Sheikh Musa Drama invited them into his mosque. So you had an Orthodox synagogue established and praying inside of the facility of a Muslim, an Islamic house of worship, a mosque, which is just incredible. And
then my Catholic students helped paint it. So it was this like amazing synergy, and the Jewish teens were there as well. So we had this amazing, and we just had a barbecue after that. And that's when I learned. They sat there. We didn't do anything. We were going to do some scriptural work with them, but I just watched them talk to each other. Like, it was wonderful. This is what we need. We need sometimes contact.
Right.
Maybe a dinner together. Not even agenda.
Maybe an iftar. I don't want you to think
maybe an iftar.
Right
Yeah. Oh no, I have a long way to go.
So my final question for you, Mehnaz, is what motivates you every day to do the work that you are doing? What's that greater vision that you have that you are seeking, so that when you wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, you're excited about where you're going to be doing in the course of the day, even though there may be quite a number of potholes on the road, a lot of challenges?
I mean, the first thing comes, like my children.
Tell us, please.
I believe in the future of my daughter and my son, and they inspire me a lot. But I think the other thing I'm going to say, which may be more overarching, is other people inspire me. When I see the kinds of work and the sacrifices people have made for others, I do study the genocide, Michael, and it is a very depressing world and dark world that I live in, and also Holocaust. But if you read the interviews in my book and you see the survivors and how after being at Auschwitz, they came out and they decided to educate others and dedicate their lives to that and did not complain. Most of them never said, I blame God or I blame anyone. Most of them didn't even say that they wanted to forgive or had the ability or the place to forgive the Nazis. I learned so much from these experiences, or learned from, nuns in Guatemala that were taken and raped, and they went out for humanitarian. I mean, I think you learn from the challenges and suffering of others and say, I have to take those lessons seriously of humanity. Otherwise, life is not worth living. I have to examine these lessons. I have to share these lessons with others, because then life is not worth living. That's how I begin my day.
Wow. Well, having marked Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, last week, this is truly an inspirational conversation for me, and I'm sure for the vast majority, if not all of our viewers. I can't thank you enough, Dr. Mehnaz Afridi, for spending so much time with us. You just gave a very inspirational conclusion to that question, but are there any final thoughts that you would want to share before we part company?
No, I mean, I just want to commend what your organization has always done, and I've really enjoyed partnering with you. And I also just want to say that it's Ramadan, and I hope for light, and I hope that you know, one of the things I always pray for is let my ego not clamor who I am,
Mm.
let it not clutter my mind and my soul. So inshallah, you know, happy Ramadan in 30 days. We'll see. But I look forward to seeing you, Michael, and thank you for hosting me. It's a real honor for me.
So thank you for with that message. You would say, Inshallah, we would say, Bezrat Hashem, and really that God should help us carry forward and bring our communities together. It's a little odd, me being in this box and you being in this box, and my having a bridge right behind me, and none of that is being put to work. So I do hope that someday we'll be able to break bread again together. And I again wish you a very meaningful Ramadan on a day-to-day basis as it continues through the month. We just began the month of ER, which is on the Hebrew calendar. Our Hebrew calendar is a lunar calendar, and that's the very same month in the lunar calendar that the Muslim population, members of the Muslim faith, are marking and celebrating Ramadan. So Ramadan Mubarak once more. And let me say thank you to you, Toda Rabbah, and Shukran, if I remember correctly in Arabic.
Yes.
And I am Michael Miller at the JCRC. I'm so happy that you were able to join us today. And we look forward to seeing you again next time on Community Relations Corner. Shalom to everybody. And thank you again to Dr. Afridi. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Shalom, salam. Bye-bye.